So Duplicant is set in the future during a pandemic of organ failure, and it focuses in the beginning on Pamela, who has to get her lungs transplanted, basically. And there's a program called the Duplicant Organ Program that gives you another set of organs whenever whatever you have fails. And that was created by Matt Travers. The problem with this program is they cost so much that you're sold into indentured servitude when you get this organ. You don't have a choice about whether you get it or not. So in order to save your life, they give you this duplicate organ, then you're sold off to the highest bidder, and you're stuck living a life you never wanted to live in the first place. And on top of it, there's a rumor that the duplicate organ program is compromised in some way. So Pamela decides to seek out Matt Travers, the person that created these organs, to try to tell him about her concerns and her fears. And that's when Matt's eyes are open to the fact that, like, this program that he had put his whole life into might be compromised. And so he's trying to fix it. And he's also upset because he's been trying to stop the indentured servitude program on top of it. So it's just like hearing someone's firsthand story kind of sets him off on this path that puts his life in danger. And so the story focuses less on the pandemic and more about the after effects of living through the pandemic. We're probably like 5 years or so into the pandemic when the book starts.
Awesome. Yeah, that sounds really cool. I love the visuals here. It looks kind of like a futuristic city. Like there's definitely a sci-fi kind of sheen to everything, you know. But I don't know. I think it's really cool because where do the organs come from? Are they being harvested from people
No, they're
or are they
being
being
made.
grown?
So they're being actually created in the lab. So that was Matt's. He's kind of like the Jonas Salk of his day. They haven't been able to find a vaccine for this pandemic, but they've been able to create duplicate organs for everyone. So they're a perfect match for you. And they have nanobots in them that help them function properly. So Matt was able to combine his knowledge of science and medicine to actually do this, because this is something that, like, even now they're still struggling to make organs in the lab. So yeah, like there's like an image in the book of one of Pamela's lungs being printed out, so to speak, for her.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really cool because it sounds like a super futuristic version of a pacemaker or something.
Yeah. Something like that, exactly.
So I guess well, I mean, when did you start working on this? Because you say pandemic is something a word that we haven't really thought about in almost 100 years. So is this something that was going on before the world crashed, or?
It was ironically, it was there's this Twitter, this tweet that's like kind of getting momentum of, what were you doing last February? What small thing were you doing last February that made this happen, that made our current pandemic happen? And I'm like, well, I was running a Kickstarter for the first two issues of my comic book about a pandemic. And then this happened. But the book was actually conceived years and years and years ago. Like, the first two issues had been in the can. The first issue had been in the can for a couple of years before the second issue was completed due to a bunch of different logistical issues on my end. And so, yeah, I definitely wasn't anticipating doing this during an actual pandemic, because who would have thought something like this would happen again?
Yeah, right.
Especially how closely some of the stuff in my book mirrors what's happening in real life has been eerie and kind of like, wow.
Yeah, I thought that was what was really cool though, is because you know, like in the beginning, there's like the little boy that's all sick and his dad's holding him and stuff, and it seems like very real world imagery, and even in that room around him it almost seems like there's almost this sense of social distancing, you know. Like they're in these very busy places, but you know, people seem very spread out in certain ways. I don't know if that's intentional, but you know, reflecting on the world we live in today, there is something interesting about all of that.
Yeah, that panel, Mariana really knocked that panel out of the park, because I scripted it, and you never know how it's going to come to life, and she just elevated it to this whole other level to make it really heart wrenching.
So, what made you think pandemic in the sense of organ failure, and why organ donation being a central theme?
So I had seen Repo the Genetic Opera, which kind of got me thinking about doing something in that vein of a Repo Men for organs, but I didn't want to quite do that specific theme because then there was also the movie Repo Men, which I haven't seen, but I knew that like it had come out, so I was like, well, I don't want to quite go down that way. And I worked in TV, so a lot of what we do in TV, especially for like law shows, which at the time I was working on Suits, is you research the headlines. So you're constantly looking at the news to try to like find something you can pull from the headlines. And so that's what I was kind of doing. I was like, well, let me see what I can find. And it just happened at that point when I was online looking for ideas of how to, take Repo the Genetic Opera and make it my own, that there were all these articles about the burgeoning field of 3D printing for organs. And I think even like Grey's Anatomy had done an episode where like Meredith was printing an organ or something in the lab. And so I was like, well, that could be a great way to do my own twist on it. And there were also all these articles at the same time about like nanotechnology and how that was going to be part of medicine in the future. And so I was like, all right, let me see what I can do with like kind of taking all these different pieces and combine them into something. And Minority Report is one of my all-time favorite movies, Blade Runner, all those things. So it was like using those as guide stones too for how I wanted to make the world look and how I wanted it to feel and how I wanted you to like, lean into trusting certain characters and then have that kind of turned on its head later on for you. So it was just a big mixing pot of different things that came together.
Yeah, that's phenomenal because like the first thing that makes me think of is whenever they grew the like hamburger meat and stuff
Yeah.
in the lab. Like whenever that news broke, I was just like, I don't know how I don't know how much I would want to eat that. It sounds kind of weird, but
Right.
my second thought was like, what is the impact on like medicine and medical culture? Whenever we would no longer have to worry about like the ethics of taking parts from somebody else, or even having to like graft your own skin from one spot to another. If we could just grow and replace that. I mean, I think that's a crazy idea, but we're headed that direction, so it's not that far
Yeah.
away.
And of course I take it and I make it like this, it's like a positive and yet it's got this horrible negative attached to it. And in the book world too, like actual human organs. So like, in our world today, if you needed a kidney transplant, you wouldn't be able to get a printout copied for you, but you would try to find a donor match. And in my world, donor matching doesn't exist. Human organs have been completely criminalized. It's illegal to do it. So what you're seeing with that family in the church is they don't want their son to be sold off to the highest bidder. So they go to this church where they've heard that there's another way. There's this illegal black market of human organs to help people who are sick and don't want to go into the duplicate organ system. But it's not necessarily safe for you to do that either.
Yeah. Yeah, that's crazy because so like if you take this transplant, then you're forced into like labor and servitude. So it kind of presents this thing of like they're saving your life, but you're also giving your life up in a way. I think that's a
Exactly.
really interesting conundrum to put a character into.
And they don't know, and most of them don't have a choice. So, when Pamela's brought into the hospital, she's basically not conscious. And so she's a young woman. They're not going to let her die. So it's like, this is the only way to save her life. So boom, she gets a duplicate organ and she's sold off. And, there's a huge fallout from that. And that's one of the things that the scientist who created these organs has been fighting against from the very beginning. When you work for these companies, you don't always have control over what's done with your creations. And so that's one of the things he's been kind of fighting against. But then he learns that there's this even darker underbelly to it all that he just wasn't even aware of. Because he kind of had his nose to the grindstone trying to find a vaccine. He was like, if I can just find a vaccine, then this stopgap measure of these duplicate organs, we can stop it and stop having these people have to worry about this, because then we'll have a vaccine and then we won't have to worry about it. But he keeps running into issues with finding a vaccine. It's taking a lot longer than he ever would have hoped it to take.
Yeah. I mean, you see that a lot, like in, like the science and medical and like really the research industry, because to do a lot of that kind of research takes tons of money and resources. So you have to work for a big company, but you also don't get to choose what happens to the results of your research.
Yeah,
And so you're kind of trying to do all this research for the better of humankind, but you don't get to say what happens to it once it leaves your possession.
exactly. And there's still a lot of diseases to this day that we don't have vaccines for. When I was growing up, there was no chickenpox vaccine. That didn't come out until, I don't know, I want to say I was in my 20s or 30s, because I got chickenpox at 16 because it just wasn't a vaccine. And, AIDS doesn't have a vaccine. I mean, there's still a lot out there that doesn't have a vaccine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have like
incredibly fortunate that they found the vaccine for COVID so quickly.
Yeah. I mean, it's a miracle how fast they turn that around. I had like one chicken pot, whatever I was like, maybe 11 or 12, and apparently that was enough to make me immune to it again. But it's weird because like once the pandemic came up, then I started hearing like that it doesn't exist anymore, that kids don't get it anymore and stuff. I was like, that's interesting. I never realized that it was just like dying out because we're just that naturally immune to it.
To chickenpox?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think it's also because there's a vaccine program for it now that helps. But
Okay.
One of the interesting things with chickenpox is once you have it, you're at risk for the rest of your life for shingles.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had multiple family members and friends who've all developed shingles from having the chickenpox. So it's like, it's great that there's a vaccine now so that people don't have to worry about not only having chickenpox, but then that like fear in the back of your head that you might get shingles somewhere down the road in your life.
Yeah, that is impressive. Yeah, because I'd always heard like once you get it once, your body develops a pretty strong immunity to chickenpox, but then it makes you susceptible to shingles. So
Yeah, exactly.
I didn't realize there was a vaccine
The
though.
virus just kind of stays dormant in you, and when it decides to reactivate, it reactivates as shingles. Which is,
Yeah.
I've watched my dad suffer through it, and it was like, it just looked like total misery.
Mm-hmm. I've never seen anybody go through it, but growing up as a kid, my grandma, she was always obsessed with telling us about the shingles. Shingles. She's like, you don't want the shingles, it'll hurt.
No, you don't want the shingles. My sister got it when she was overseas. She was in her 20s, which is like super young. Usually you don't get shingles until, you're older.
Mm-hmm.
And she got it when she was overseas in her 20s, and she was supposed to fly home. I think she was in like Denmark or something. And she had to hide the fact that she was sick to get on the plane. Because otherwise they wouldn't let her leave the country and come back in here. And it's like, you think about that now, because that's kind of what people are doing now with COVID. They're like, oh, I'm fine. And they're getting on the plane.
Yeah. Ain't that the truth? I guess the other question I wanted to ask you about this is, what about like research and stuff? How much do you know about medical? How much research did you do? And did that research help you whenever COVID came along? Were you already kind of aware of some of those measures?
No, I was not aware of a lot of the measures. I mean, most of my research was basically in the making of it. Most of my research focused on like how organs would be made in the future, like how that technology is going to work and how the nanotechnology was going to work. And then the pandemic part of it, because the book doesn't focus so much on the pandemic part. It's mostly dealing with the fallout of this tech that was meant to save humanity from the pandemic. So my research on the actual pandemic part wasn't as detailed as my research on the tech itself that creates the duplicant organs. Like, I totally missed out on the fact that masks were a thing with the flu pandemic back in the early 1900s, and that should have come up in my research, and it didn't. Because I definitely, now in these issues that are being made now, I'm trying to be more aware of like making sure people are wearing masks all the time, especially the medical personnel. But if you look in the first couple of issues, it's like it's scattered how many people are wearing masks. So I was just like, well, make sure people are wearing masks, but don't put everyone in masks.
Now you're like, no, everybody needs a mask.
I know, now I'm like, everyone needs to wear a mask.
Yeah, that's crazy. I was just thinking, like germ theory and stuff in general. Something I still don't really know that much about, but we suddenly all got a crash course in like how bacteria and germs spread so rapidly. So
Yeah,
um,
exactly.
it's just crazy, like that you were thinking about like a pandemic in terms of like something that massive, and then it happened.
Yeah,
Um, but it's really interesting. Like I know a lot of people say they don't want to, like everybody's saying like I don't want TV to come out that's all about pandemic. I just lived it. I don't want a
right,
quarantine show.
right.
And and so like I think this is really cool because it doesn't feel like the world we live in. So it's not
Mhm.
really like rehashing a lot of what we've been through. Whether that's traumatic or not, I don't know, but
Right.
some of us have been in some tough positions because of this pandemic. So I think like that whole aspect of it's interesting. I guess the other thing I would like to know too is why a comic book? Why did you decide to write a comic book? Is this your first effort in writing comics?
It is my first effort in writing comics. So I worked in film and TV for a little over 15 years, and I was looking to make myself stand out as a staff writer. And so I had written Duplicant as a pilot script, and I decided to look into writing comic books. I looked up courses to take on the writing of it, and I found a class at Meltdown Comics, which was this like massive comic book store in West Hollywood, California, that has sadly shuttered pre-pandemic.
Mm.
And they had a class there, and that's where I met like all my comic book friends who I send my material to. I actually just right before we talked, got finished giving my friend Rylan Grant notes on his latest comic book script. He's done Banjax and Aberrant and the Peacekeepers. And yeah, I just was
That's
like, well,
awesome.
I'll just do this
Banjax
as
is really
a,
cool.
hmm?
I said that's awesome. Banjax is really cool.
Yeah, Banjax, I've read all the scripts for those.
That's amazing. What a weird connection.
Yeah, so the script I just read was for the latest Peacekeepers.
Oh,
And then
nice.
before that, I just looked at Stephen Prince's Monster Matador Kickstarter because he's going to launch his next Kickstarter in April. And so the class was meant to teach you how to write like a one-off comic book, just, a single issue comic book. But Ryland and I and, Jeff Leeds and a couple other people in the class were like, well, we actually want to make this more. Because I initially thought that's what I was going to do. I was just going to make this a one-off script because Pamela was originally just a one scene character in my pilot script. But when I started to take the class and I started to like understand how this medium works more and how to write it and script it and like think about the pages and the layouts and the, the captions and everything, I was like, well, Pamela needs to be more than just a one scene character. And so she kind of blossomed into this much bigger character that continues through the series in one way or another. And it also helped me dive more into all of my characters, like all their backgrounds and, their personal lives and everything. And I just kind of fell in love with the medium because in TV, you never know if what you're writing is going to get made. You can write until you're blue in the face and half of it, more than half of it, or even all of it can just sit on a shelf for your entire life and never see the light of day. You're not always getting what you write on screen. And so the idea with a comic book was like, well, the only obstacle in my way is money. And at the time, I was fortunate to have been working 2 full-time jobs. I was on The Good Wife and I was on Brain Dead as their script coordinator for both shows. And so I had a little bit extra money I could use to spend to actually pay to bring my script to life. And so it just kind of went from there.
Wow, that's phenomenal. I never watched The Good Wife, but I always heard that it was one of those like shows everybody was missing. So
it's a really great show. It was a fantastic show, and it was a good group of people to work with.
that's awesome. What about like sci-fi and stuff? Because there's like sci-fi elements. I mean, I assume a big part of that is because of the medical technology you wanted to focus on. It needed to be a little sci-fi-y, but I mean, you even went into like weapons, and some of the clothing looks a little like future sci-fi and stuff like that.
Yeah. So whenever I needed to give Mariana specifics, because I wanted everything to have a very specific futuristic feel, especially in the first issue when we were just figuring out how to work together, I relied pretty heavily on reference imagery. So I would just go online and I would research what people were anticipating the future to look like for certain things. And in some cases, there's nothing out there. So I would just have to kind of like make my own thing, so to speak. I'd be like, well, how about like a combination of this image and this image, I would tell her. Or if there was actual designs of things of what they were supposed to look like in the future, then I would be like, okay, so like, I like these 3 images, do your own take on them. Because I wanted to make sure she had some flexibility with being able to do her own spin on things. So it didn't feel like she was just,
Colored by
tracing whatever I sent her.
Yeah, that's like the biggest thing I hear is you don't want to bring an artist on and like have everything fully conceptualized, because then they're not having fun. Giving them the creative room and the creative freedom, with some parameters usually creates a better work situation, because, how much do we like to be told what to write exactly, so.
Yeah, it's funny because my panel descriptions, sometimes they're really short. If there's nothing like, if it's just more like a setup, like these 2 people are talking to each other. But sometimes they can be really, there's, sometimes it's like 2 or 3 paragraphs, especially if it's an emotional moment and I need to kind of help her get into the character's head so she knows what's going on in them, to help her figure out how to make that emote with their body language and their face.
Yeah, because they got to, physically convey all the information that you're giving. So anything to help get inside, I'm sure helps a lot more. And so you wrote for TV and stuff. You have that background, and you've created a pretty impressive comic. So
thank you.
Like, what's the difference between the two? How do you feel about the formats and the writing and scripting and stuff?
So in TV, you're basically taught to not put too much description in, because you don't want to step on the toes of the director and the production designer and the costume designer and all those people. So it's like this fine line of like, you want to make sure you're putting enough description in so they know what the heck you're talking about, but not enough where you're stifling them from being able to put their own vision on it. And plus, when people read TV and film scripts, the general rule is like one page is 1 minute of screen time. And I mean, it's a little different in TV, but so you don't want these like big blocks, big paragraphs that people have to read through. You want like these little tiny paragraphs and then dialogue. So that was a change for me with comics, because you don't want a ton of dialogue, because then it overpowers the panel, it overpowers the page, and you're not letting these moments breathe. So it was a change to like really refine the dialogue and try to like get as much information across in as few words as possible without cutting back on the character, to make sure that the character's voice is still present. And then also just, okay, now I have free reign to actually tell you everything I want this to be, as opposed to TV where you kind of have to hold that back a little bit. So it was like, all right, now I really have to be specific, because someone's going to draw this. And I need to be like, okay, well, this person looks like this. This is what this person is going to wear. You're doing everything. You're doing all the departments that a TV show would do as the creator, writer of the comic book. So it was a lot more creative freedom in that respect.
I imagine it's also a little bit different. I mean, I don't know how you were working in TV, but I know a lot of TV does work in writers' rooms, and so there's a lot more collaboration going on within the writing and scripting versus comic books tend to be like 1 to 2 people doing all the scripting, So I'm sure that was a interesting change of pace for you too.
Yeah, it definitely was, because when I worked on Suits, I wrote 1 episode of Suits, and you're in a room with like 5 or 6 other people or more, depending on the room, and you're all there helping break the story down. So you go in there and you break the story down, and once you have like a kind of a sketch of what the episode is going to be, then you're going to break down each individual scene in the room. So it's like you already know what each scene is going to be in the script before you leave the room to go write it as an outline. And then even that goes through like a bunch of different hands and people. Other people do passes at your work. you know, and even like the episode scripts, it's like you write your episode script, but then your showrunner is always going to end up doing a pass at your script. So it's like, it's this weird mix of like, it's your episode, but you weren't the only person that wrote it.
Yeah. Yeah, I know Rick and Morty. One of the coolest things to me, Jeff Loveness, he writes some comics and he does some TV writing and stuff. And I thought one of the coolest things was he actually wrote an episode of Rick and Morty. Like whenever it does the intro credits, his name, you know, pretty much every other episode of that show has, you know, multiple names credited for writing. And for him to have the only name as a writing credit on an episode, I think is really impressive, you know, in a show that's known for how big the staff is. And then, you know, I watched interviews with him and like he would post pictures on his social media of just like that little intro card. And it is like and even watching the interviews, he talks about like how many other people really were truly involved, but because he wrote a majority of what got put to screen, he got the full credit, you know. And
yeah, that's exactly it. Like, you know, there's something called arbitration in television and screenwriting. If a writer wants to fight the credit that's being given, and the Writers Guild goes by who wrote the majority of the script is usually who gets the leading credit or the sole credit. So it's interesting.
Yeah, it's a really interesting process, you know. I imagine there's also this sense of if you're in a room and you're trying to break the story, you know, if you say, oh, like, here's an idea, then the next person at the table is like, oh, and what if we do this, you know, and it kind of snowballs. Whereas comic book writing, script writing, especially for just one person, you're really only getting that kind of feedback once you've kind of finished your draft and sent it off to somebody to read through for you, you know. So I imagine that changes that a lot. So I imagine that changes a lot of stuff too, because you know, it's just like a really different sense of collaboration.
It is. It's a very different sense. So I'm very grateful that I have my writing group who can read my scripts and give me feedback, because I'm definitely used to having, you know, a much longer gestation period from TV with writing stuff than you typically get with comics to write stuff.
How many drafts do you usually do?
That's a good question. I can probably pull it up and look. I mean, issue 1 went through like a ton of drafts because that was the first one that I wrote.
Yeah, you're trying to establish a lot. I imagine that one really takes some time to hammer out.
Yeah, it looks like I started that in July of 2015, and I was tweaking it through September of 2016.
Oh, wow.
So that one had a very long gestation period. But like, I think like issue 3 went through a lot of drafts because I had a couple. It's like it goes to Mariana, and you know, usually the script is pretty tight for the art when it gets to her. But sometimes I'll have a page where she'll send me the sketch, and I'll be like, this isn't working, and it's not because of her. It's because I just didn't script the page well. So luckily, I can catch that at the sketch stage. And then I usually re-script the page at that point to make it work. I know that happened on issue 4, and the subsequent page, I wish I could share it because it's like, it's one of the best pages I think Mariana's ever done. It's just this awesome page, and it's got these really great like shots and everything, but it's a total spoiler page. So I can't share it, but it's like, it was all inside a car, and doing anything inside a car is just difficult because there's only so many things you could do. So the way I had scripted it originally, it just felt too static and it just wasn't working. So I found this video that's no longer available online. I must have just caught it at the right time, of different cinematic shots in cars. And so I just like watched it over and over and over again until I could in my head figure out how to make that page work. And then I like screenshotted from the video what I wanted Mariana to do, so she knew what angles I was looking to have, and then she just brought it to life.
Wow, that's awesome. That yeah, I can imagine, because like to me that's what is really impressive about some of these movies and shows that are like single location and stuff is I mean, I think one of the more notable examples is Reservoir Dogs, you know, like how do you keep something like that interesting, you know? And I imagine it's even harder when you're talking about a comic book where nothing is truly in motion. You have to kind of mimic and create that effect. And I imagine it gets really hard, especially in a car that has like 4 seats.
Yep, yeah, exactly. And it was definitely tricky because this issue had a lot more static scenes than previous. Like the previous issue was very action packed, but this issue, by nature of how the previous issue ended, needed to be a little more static. So it was just a matter of like, how do I make this as visually interesting as possible? And a lot of it was, there's a lot of flashbacks. So you're cutting away from what's happening to look back at what brought this to happen, this moment that they're in.
Yeah. What about Mariana? You mentioned her quite a bit. How did you team up with her? Where does she come from and all of
So
that?
she's in Poland, and Ryland actually is the one that helped hook me up with her. She was an artist that this guy Carol knows, and Carol is this guy that just like knows all these great artists all over the world. And so Ryland knew Carol and put me in touch with Carol, and I showed Carol the script, and he suggested a couple of artists, and Mariana was the one that I felt had the best style to match what I wanted, not only the book to look like, but the ability to do the faces, which are so important in my book.
Yes, yeah, I agree. I one thing I've really come to love is comic books that it doesn't matter like how I guess like how strong the art is or what style it's in. If
Mm-hmm.
you can emote and make these characters act in a comic book, that will blow me away more than anything else you can do. They can
Yeah.
have like gangly hands and stuff, like, but if I can tell what the character's thinking through the face, like I'm sold. It doesn't even matter.
Yeah, and she does that. She just is like amazing at doing that.
What's the art process like? So you put together a real tight script and send it over to her. Does she send you one page at a time? Is she sending you back like
It
bulk counts of
depends.
pages?
It depends on the pages, and I think it depends on how much work she has to do on them. Sometimes I'll just get one page from her. Sometimes I'll get like 5 pages at a clip. She usually saves the hardest pages for last, and she'll ask me questions along the way for them, and then those she'll sometimes send just one at a time. So she'll send me pencil sketches, and if she feels like she can do something a little bit differently from the script to make it work better, she'll do that. So she'll send me like a couple of different versions of a page if she feels like there's different angles that would work better than what I scripted, and then I just approve it from there, and then she goes to inks. Usually once I approve it on the sketches, at this point in the process, because we've been working together for so long, that's usually it as far as like my notes, unless there's some major problem. She shows me the other stages along the way, but there's usually very little I need to note at this point. When it was the first issue, because we were just kind of like creating this world and learning how to work together, there was a lot more back and forth. There were a lot more revisions. It was definitely a little bit more tricky. But now it's pretty painless at this point, unless it's like I said, like that page that didn't work and I have to just completely rethink it.
Yeah. And what about colors? Is she doing the colors too, or is that
She's doing the
someone else?
colors too, and I haven't had to give her any notes on the colors because I think her color work is so excellent. I think
Hmm.
again, I think it was only in the first issue I gave her color notes, but now it has to be something really out there for me to be like, this isn't working, because typically her color work is something I don't need to comment on. But the first issue was different, but that's just because I think it was the first issue we did together.
Yeah, I really like it because her line work, especially in architecture, is very clean, very straight, very structured, very clean. And to me, that's what presents a lot of this, like kind of futuristic aesthetic. Those very like imperial style buildings.
Yeah.
And so she takes that and then she takes all the colors and does them, and I mean they look like real world colors. Like nothing's really that different from what you would see today. But I really like that because it gives me the impression of the future, but at the same time, it feels authentic and real, like the near future. Because
Yeah.
this lady's wearing a blue and white striped shirt, like something we would see today, you know? And so it kind of like connects it to like, this is not today, but it's also not like 1,000 years in the future. It feels very appropriate, I guess is the best way to put it.
Yeah, it's definitely been a good mix, and I think you're talking. Are you talking about the nightgown that she's wearing? It's like blue and white striped that Pamela's
Yeah.
wearing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think
so
she's
that
like
was
brushing her
actually
teeth or
like something
something.
I used to own that I like scripted in, and I was like, have her wear this,
That's awesome.
and she just brought it to life.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like, the buildings and like these officers, I guess they're like police officers or something.
Yeah, those
Um,
were the officers were one of those things where I had to give her specific imagery to do, and then she kind of did her own spin on them.
Yeah, see, they kind of have like slightly futuristic looking clothes, but
Hmm.
everything else just looks so modern, and again, it just drives home that idea that like this is the near future, and these are things that are very much on the horizon for us as a species, as a society.
Yeah.
And lettering, where does that come into play?
So Josh Reed did the lettering on the first issue, and then he got hired by DC Comics, and they don't allow him to work on outside projects. So he hooked me up with Carlos, who used to work at DC Comics, and now he's freelance, and he's done all the work on issues 2 forward. They've both been great. Josh did the duplicant logo that's on the front covers with the little lungs,
Hmm. Yeah,
and
that's really cool.
yeah, and Carlos has been great because like there were a couple pages in issue 3 where I was like, oh, I messed up. This isn't working. I don't know what happened. And it's like the art is already finished, and I'm just like, what did I do? And I was like, all right, well, let's see what Carlos can do with the lettering. And he did the lettering, and I was like, he saved the page. The page looks amazing. Like he just took what I wrote, and sometimes with the lettering, because again, I'm still learning about a lot of this. I'll be like, okay, so like this is what I'm thinking for what I want this to look like. A lot of it I just give him the freedom to do, but if it's something like sometimes I'll have ghosts come in this comic, and so things like that, I'll be like, okay, so this is what is happening, and this is what I'm looking to have happen, and he'll just like get it, and he'll bring it to life in a way that you're like, oh, this is great. Or I'll be like, I think we need a sound effect here, but I don't know what sound effect is right for here. Let me know what you think, and he'll just add it in, and it'll be perfect for whatever it needs to be.
Isn't it amazing, like how important lettering is to a
It's
comic book?
incredibly important.
Like, yeah, there's like seasoned comic book readers that don't even realize it sometimes, like it makes or breaks the book because I mean, like you were saying, like the page is done and it looks great, but there's nothing to read, and once I
Yeah.
add that in, is it gonna work still, and um
Exactly. And I've actually, that's one of the other than the art being great, is people consistently comment on how good the lettering is on my books, which only further cemented how important it is when you have like publishers and other comic professionals going, oh, the
mhm.
lettering on this is really good. Because it's like if the lettering isn't good, it just messes up the whole reading of it.
Yeah. Yeah, and a lot of people they start and generally stick to like Marvel and DC, and even Image, like that's the major leagues. If you're there, you've made it,
Right.
And so even on their worst day, they're presenting quality material, but when you start to dive into some indies and stuff, that's where you really actually learn, in my opinion, because like I read a comic book one time, like an indie book, right? And I was
Mhm.
like, this is cool, but something's not quite right. And I kept reading, and I was like, something just doesn't feel like perfect about this, even though it looks like it should. And eventually I realized the artist, he kept having all the action and stuff kept moving. Every panel, it felt like the action was moving from right to left, right? So
Mhm.
if a character's running, he's running this way. And I'm like, but I'm flipping this way. So like, and it was in that moment I realized how important it is for an artist not just to be good at drawing something, but to understand how the flow of action looks. And
Yeah.
when you're flipping pages and the guy's running the opposite direction, it gets real weird real quick.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's like
And,
the amount of work that the artist needs to do to make sure that the page makes visual sense is insane.
mhm. Yeah, like there's so many like micro elements to artwork in comics that if any one of those is off, it can ruin the whole image.
Yep.
And sometimes you don't even know why. You're just looking at it like, I don't know why this isn't right. It's the same way with lettering, though. You start to get into indies, and you see some people like this. I mean, you have very professional looking lettering, but I've also read some indies where it's like, I'm not even sure what they're saying anymore, you know?
Right.
So, I mean, kudos to you for finding such talent to bring in and help you with this.
Thank
It's really
you.
impressive work.
Thank you. I've been incredibly fortunate.
Yeah, understandable. Cause it's always like crazy to me to hear the stories. Like I just talked to Milton Lawson, and he was working on a story, and he was like, I found an artist online, and I really liked him, and I reached out to him, and he was booked. He was busy, and
Yeah,
he said so he
happens.
didn't really he wasn't sure what to do, and so he found him on like ArtStation or something like that. And he said what was really cool there is like you can go to their profile and you can see what they're liking. So like what other images they're liking. And he was like, I went to his page and I saw he kept liking this one guy's artwork. Like there was just one guy, just tons of likes and stuff. And so he reached out to that guy and got that guy. And I'm like, that's an awesome story.
A great idea. Looking at who the artist likes, that's actually a really great idea. I'll have to do that myself whenever I need a new artist on my next project.
And is there anybody else on the team that we should be highlighting?
Duca and Owen Gianni do all the cover work. So Layla does the line work and Owen does the colors on the covers.
Okay. I really I haven't even looked at the other cover, but I really like this first one, Duplicant Special Kickstarter Edition.
Oh, the one with Matt and his heart?
Yeah, the way that like all the organs are coming out. He's like that's such a cool.
The most difficult cover we had too, because like the first cover was pretty easy. I would say the third cover was like super easy. Like I knew what I wanted it to be. Layla gave me a couple sketches, and I was like, because the first sketch, the third cover is Ava and her eyeballs coming out of her head.
Oh,
and
that sounds really cool.
Was just one eyeball. It was like a couple of different versions of just one eyeball, and I was like, what if we did two? Let's do two eyeballs. And it was just done. It was like once she did that sketch, I was like, oh, this is it. But yeah, the second one was difficult because that was when we were like, when Layla was like, okay, I know you have all these different ideas of what you want it to be, but we should really set a tone for the book and have like a consistent look for every book. She's like, it'll help you sell the book, and it'll make you more recognizable in the marketplace. So then it was like, well, what's it going to be? I knew I wanted it to be Matt and his heart, but then it was like, which way did we want it? And we went through a bunch of different iterations until we landed on the one that became the cover.
That's awesome. Yeah, I imagine that was a difficult concept to come up with, just because like you're drawing all this stuff phasing out of them, even a lot of the pages, like you have like these visual, I don't know, it's almost like projected screens or something, so there's like always this sense of opacity.
I was like, make it holographic. She's probably like, damn the holographs.
Yeah, I love it, but I mean, it looks so good in the book. I would not take it away, but I imagine as the artist, you're like, man, now I got to draw like everything in front of and behind it.
Well, exactly, and then I would imagine the coloring is incredibly difficult to do for something like that, to make sure it comes across as actually holographic on top of it. She's probably like, oh, these holographs.
Yeah, it's crazy because like I'm no artist, but I find it relaxing, and so I'll just like scribble and draw. So the idea of like picking up a pencil or something and making lines, like I can totally get, but I cannot for the life of me understand how colorists do this. I don't know what they're doing. Like I've seen videos where they like scan an image into Photoshop and then they do all these things and then they click buttons and colors start appearing. And I'm like, I don't know. Like, what are you doing right now? It's like magic.
It is. It's absolutely like magic.
In my head, it's like, okay, well, here's an image I scanned in. So if you like dump a color on it, that's all one color, but they'll just like hit it. And it's like one little spot and stuff. Yeah.
And the shadowing. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a real magic. And it's something that I've actually gotten really interested in. There was a long time I didn't really pay that much attention to colors. And then recently there's been a lot of books coming out that just have amazing color work done on them, and I'm like, you know what? I think I kind of like color.
Yep.
Like you never notice it until it gets really good. Um, so I guess the other thing I wanted to ask you is, what is the future of Duplicant? Because this was 1 and 2, where in the first one it's like 60 pages, right?
Yeah, so the first Kickstarter was 1 and 2 we did as a perfect bound book, which combined both issues. And then issue 3 Kickstarter we did last summer. And I'm running the issue 4 Kickstarter now. And then issue 5 will probably be in the fall, I would say, late fall. And then I'm probably going to take a little bit of a break and then dive in to do the next arc of the story.
Awesome. And you said you have a Kickstarter coming up, right?
It's running right now. It ends on...
Oh, it is running right now.
4th, I want to say. And then I'm also with a publisher, Second Sight, so everything on the Kickstarter is exclusive to the Kickstarter. Second Sight is publishing me through previews, and so we'll be in comic book stores starting April 7th with a bi-monthly release.
Nice. Yeah, that makes a huge difference being in actual shops and stuff. I love Kickstarter. I think it's an amazing platform, and it's done a lot for the industry and like opening it up, you know?
Yeah.
And so I think it's amazing, and I've picked up a lot of books there, but at the same time, there's just nothing that compares to the amount of eyeballs you get if you can get into previews and into the actual stores.
I know. I'm hoping my numbers are good from previews. We'll see. I should hear, I would imagine sometime in March, what my sales numbers were like, because I was in previews for February for the April release.
Yeah, that's awesome. And what else are you working on? Is there anything else we should be looking forward to?
Yeah, so there's a literary anthology called Friction that publishes quarterly, and it's mainly short stories in them, but they always feature one comic story. And so I'll be the one comic story, I believe, for their winter edition. So the script is already finished on that. The contract is signed, so now I'm just waiting for them to help me pick out an artist, and then we'll get that drawn up. So that's going to be another set in the future one during a frozen apocalypse, and which probably is a little too close to home for people in Texas right now.
Right.
And is about a woman and her dog trying to survive. So that was not totally inspired by Snowpiercer, but kind of like that idea of like a frozen world like that was kind of like my jumping off point for that. And also NPR used to do this thing called 3-minute fiction, where they would give you a prompt for writing like a single page story. And sometimes they would give you a picture. And this one was a picture of a cruise ship stuck in the snow. And so that was also my jumping off point for that. And so I adapted that short fiction piece into this comic story. And then I'm creating an animated series with animator and paranormal expert Sapphire Sandalo that we're writing the pilot script for now. We've already done the pitch document. We've had a couple of interested parties, but they all want to see the pilot script, so that's what we're working on now. And I got asked to write a short Christmas horror story that I have to start working on at some point. But yeah, that's juggling.
Yeah, that's awesome. It sounds like you got a lot on your plate, you know. I can't imagine you have that much time to write anything.
Yeah, well, and running the Kickstarter is always, stressful, especially when you don't fund right away. You're like,
have you ever seen, I want to say it's called Never Let Me Go? Is that the name of the movie?
I know the name of it. I know the name of that one. Remind me what it's about, and I'll look it up at the same time.
What I'm thinking about, at least, it's also a novel that was adapted into a movie. And it's about, like, basically these people are clones of babies, and they're raised.
Oh, yes. I have heard of this. I've never watched it, but yeah, I know what you're talking about. It sounded really interesting.
Yeah, like they're basically raised for their organs. So if that person has an accident or something, they automatically have a match because it's a clone. They're like raised in captivity and stuff. it was a pretty interesting movie that I kind of thought about. I haven't watched it in years, but it came to mind as soon as I started reading Duplicant. I was like, oh yeah, like the whole like organ harvesting and all of that, is really interesting stuff. And I wanted to ask you, do you listen to Script Notes? That's what it's called, right?
No.
Wow, I'm suddenly forgetting names of everything. Script Notes is a podcast. It's Craig Mazin and John August.
Oh yeah. I know those. I mean, I know who they are. I don't know them,
Yeah,
but I know who they are. I know of the podcast, but I haven't listened to it.
yeah. I listen to it regularly. I love it. It's one of my favorites. I'm guilty of listening to a lot of podcasts and stuff about things that may or may not interest me, but the hosts are like really interesting and engaging.
Mm-hmm.
I have no care in the world at all for like professional wrestling, but
Right.
sometimes I'll stumble across a podcast with people that are just so good at it that I'm like, I'll listen to you talk about wrestling. I'm still not going to watch it, though.
Awesome.
So Script Notes is one of those where it's like, I'm interested in writing, but like I've never really been interested in pursuing like screenwriting. But those guys, they're a really great little duo. So that might be in your wheelhouse if you listen to any podcasts. I don't know if
I
that's
should, because I've been looking for podcasts to listen to, so I should put that in the wheelhouse.
Awesome. And then I guess the last thing is there anything that you want to plug? Any place that people should look for you, follow you, be able to keep up with you?
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram and Twitter under the handle Musings by Crazed, MUSINGSBYCRAZED. And then the Kickstarter for Duplicant can be found online. If you just go to the Kickstarter page and search Duplicant, you can find it that way, or you can also do bit.ly/duplicant4, the number 4, and that will take you to the Kickstarter. And then my website is my name, karlanappi.com, KARLANAPPI.
Awesome. And on your Kickstarter, because this is a thing I hear a lot of people not too sure about. On your Kickstarter, is there opportunities to get all of the books, the previous books? That way they can jump in? Because this is the 4th one. I don't want anybody to think they can only get number 4 if that's not.
No, all the books are available. So you can do the catch-up tier as a digital catch-up tier or a hard copy catch-up tier. And then also if, like, say you had 1 and 2, but you missed the campaign for issue 3, I had issue 3 as like just a separate add-on that you can do. That's
awesome. Well, I've had a blast talking with you, and I'm really interested in what you're doing. It sounds like you have a lot going on, and I don't know if that's something people still say, but like a lot of fingers in the pies or whatever,
Yeah.
A lot of irons in the fire. There you go.
Irons in the
I think
fire,
that one's still current. So I'm really excited to see what you have going on and what's coming out. So I had a blast talking with you. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.